Hey everyone, and welcome to another video. Tonight we have 2 hours of horror stories. I hope you all enjoy them. I feel that this is one of the best videos I've posted in a very long time. I really enjoyed the stories in this one, so I hope you all enjoy them too. I did ask for 500 likes on my previous video. As of the recording of this intro, it's currently a little bit over 600. I just wanted to say thank you all so much. I honestly didn't even expect it to hit 500. I'm not going to ask for a like goal on this one. I really appreciate everybody dropping a like on the last one. Just if you enjoy the video, a like is very much appreciated. Subscribing if you're new is also very appreciated, as I post content just like this all the time. Telling a friend, all of that jazz. You all know the script at this point. It's getting a lot warmer outside lately. I hope you're all enjoying life. I hope you're all having fun. I picked up the Rubik's Cube like a couple months ago, and I've been having so much fun with it. I can currently solve it in about 50 seconds, which I know isn't like speed cubing fast, but it's pretty good for me, I feel like. For only being into it for 2 months, I'm having a lot of fun with it. I want to try and be able to like get underneath 20 seconds. I don't know how possible it is, but I think I could do it. With enough practice, I think I could do it. I also picked up a hacky sack today. I was really excited about that. I haven't played with one since like high school, so I'm really excited to play with that as well. Anyways, it's getting warmer out. There's good vibes, and I hope you're all enjoying it as much as I am. Anyways, sit back, do whatever it is that you do to relax, and as always, I hope you all have a great night. He's dead, I thought, finally realizing, stood over his body. What am I going to do? And truth was, I had no idea. Murder was a serious charge. I'd watched those true crime documentaries. I knew how this worked. The killer always gets caught no matter what. God, I'm a killer. I looked around. We were in a small clearing in the woods east from my house, woods that nobody ever went into, which was partly why we did. It was so that we could do whatever we wanted. You know, stupid challenges, games, that sort of thing. Stuff for laughs. But I wasn't laughing, and Josh certainly wasn't either. I looked back down at his body. It was awful. His clothes were torn and tattered, and his face was split open in an awful way, down the left side of his head. You'd have to squint hard if you even wanted to lie to yourself that it looked anything remotely human. I felt another pang of adrenaline. I need to be smart. I need to make this go away. I have to. I moved over to my left. There was a ditch here, about 2 meters deep, shallow on one side but rocky on the other. I looked back behind me towards Josh's bike and started to piece a story together. Maybe, I thought, maybe he was riding his bike down here. He got distracted by something. Maybe he went into these sharp rocks. Along the shallow side of the ditch, there was a bit where the rim turned upwards, like a ramp. Okay, he went along here, this ramp, got distracted, hit the rocks. It was the only thing I could think of. Maybe the sharp rocks slit his face like that. It might be a little far-fetched, but it was the best I could think of. I took a deep breath and lifted Josh. He was heavier than I thought, and I almost slipped in the wet dirt as I hoisted him over my shoulder and carefully placed him in the ditch. I tried to make it look like he was crawling away. He probably wouldn't have died straight away. Satisfied with the placement of him, I turned my attention to the bike. It was still pristine, as me and him had just stopped and leant them against a tree earlier on. That's not going to work, I thought. It needs to be bashed up more. I grabbed his bike and slowly rolled it down the mud in the path it would have gone, and then lifted it up and threw it across the ditch into the rocks. I picked it back up and did it again. That looks alright. I didn't pick it back up afterwards. It was already in a good spot and probably would be more authentic if I didn't pose it. The last thing I did was take my jacket off, and with the blood all on it, hoisted it under my arm, put it on the seat of my bike, and, after taking one last look back, rode back home. I left Josh there, and with him, a little bit of myself as well. I unlocked the front door of my house and hurried inside. I ran up to my room immediately and hid the coat under my bed. I'll figure out what to do with it later. I dulled my brain with a shooter game, barely paying attention. The rain outside was a small mercy. Maybe it would wash some evidence away. My mom was coming back from work by now, and so I was now trying to act in higher spirits so nothing seemed too off. I guess I probably had up until this evening before the police would be called. Josh usually lingered in town for a few hours after we hung out, and so it wasn't unusual for him to be home late, but he wouldn't come home today. I heard the key turn in the door. It made me jump. I got up and plastered a smile across my face and went to meet her at the front door. "Hello, Dan," she called from the hallway. "Hey, Mom," I said, lingering in the doorway, arms crossed. "Did you have fun with Josh today?" she said, back turned to me, hanging her coat up. Yeah, I did. Had to come home a bit early, though. He said he needed to do something." Well, I'm sure it was important. Anyway, it's the holidays now. You could always hang out with him tomorrow." "Yeah," I said, my smile slowly fading. When I went to bed that night, every time I closed my eyes, I could see that ditch etched into my mind. The mangled roots, the mangled bike, the mangled body. I got maybe half an hour of sleep before my alarm jolted me awake at 5 a.m. I immediately remembered Josh's face. Twisted, warped, impossible. I felt like a stranger in my skin. The air was suffocating. The rooms in my house felt far larger than I'd ever noticed, and that they had any right to be. Large and empty. Nothing felt right. I don't know how to describe it to you because I can't even fully understand it myself, but the thought of Josh's parents sat there, worry building, waiting anxiously for a boy who would never come back, their only son, made me feel... I felt sick. I'm not sure if my mom had noticed that something was up. I mean, she must have. But I noticed her giving me weird looks for that entire morning. Occasional glances. All of this pressure kept building and building and building and building to an almost unbearable level until, at about 1 in the afternoon, there was a knock on the door. My mom answered it, and as I sat there in the living room, head in my hands, I could hear what the man at the door was saying. It was muffled, but clear enough for me to hear parts of it. "Yes, no, he didn't. His parents haven't seen him. If we could just..." "Dan?" my mom said, opening the door and letting the man in the room. "This man here just needs to ask you some questions. It's about Josh." I bottled everything down, swallowed, and then spoke as clearly as I could. Maybe a little bit too quickly, but it was the best I could do. "Josh?" I looked away from my mom and now at the officer. He had a warm, kind facial expression, but with a tinge of unease and awkwardness. He was about to break the news. "I'm not supposed to know yet." "What happened to him?" I chuckled slightly. "Has he gotten himself into some more..." I trailed off. "Listen, Dan, Josh hasn't been seen since yesterday morning. Now, we've spoken to his mother, and she says that she saw him last when he went out with you. Now, if that's true, this means that you might have been the last person to see him." I was staring at the name tag on his uniform. I didn't interpret it as letters, just shapes. I wasn't really focusing on it anyway. He shuffled on his seat slightly. "Look, I know it's a lot to handle right now, and I understand that you two were close, but do you think that we could just ask you some questions?" I told him that we went up into the woods, although I lied about where exactly. Then I said that after a little while of just chilling out, he'd gone further in, and I'd just turned around and gotten home. All the while, the officer was nodding comfortably and never once changed facial expression from that slight smile, the smile that didn't reach his eyes. I suppose I was relieved, I guess, that I wasn't being taken in or arrested. In fact, I didn't get any sort of feeling that he even considered me a suspect, and I don't blame him. I don't have a history of anything. I never get into fights at school. I sleep I never got into fistfights at school. I keep my head down. There's not a whole lot to go on there. And one kid in the woods on his own, anything could have happened. A murder, especially by the kid's best friend, probably wouldn't be high on the list of possibilities. After about an hour, the officer left, saying he would keep us posted on the search effort, and that was that. Apart from the odd missing person poster up around town, there wasn't really much reminding me of Josh. I'd stopped riding my bike though. That, at least, was something that reminded me of that scene, but it was getting easier. I got rid of the jacket with all that blood on it, and although the officers came back to the house a few times, I stuck to the same story, and after a few days they stopped. I felt like I could finally start moving on at least. And occasionally, I'd pass by the window of Josh's house on the way into town and see his mother sat, head in hands, and she'd give me that comfortable smile. The same one that didn't quite reach the eyes. And I'd return it, and deep down, I didn't know if it was worse. That I had done the crime in the first place, or the fact that I was brushing it off so easily. However, this brief comfort ended about a week after the day I'd killed him, because after I'd hidden his mangled body in a ditch and lied to everyone I knew, I got a knock at the door, and as I peered through the window to check who it was, my blood ran cold. Josh was stood outside my front door, grinning. I just kind of stood there, like an idiot. It was him, of course it was. It was Josh, and somehow his face looked fine. It looked normal. His face was all back in place, and his clothes looked fine. He'd noticed me by this point. He waved to grab my attention, and with that grin still on his face, eagerly pointed towards the door, mouthing, "Let me in." I didn't know exactly what to think, but I found myself unlocking the front door, and there he was. The person I'd left muddied and bloodied in the woods stood about a meter away from me, clean and healthy. He pushed past me without a word and walked in. "Hey, I thought we were going back out to the woods today." It took me a second to turn around and face him, to process what he just said. "Josh, you... Well, are we gonna go then?" He interrupted, still grinning, but with slight impatience. He pushed back past me into the garden before I even had a chance to say anything, and got on his bike that he had left leant against the front of my house. That clean, very much not battered bike. I rode next to him. It wasn't possible. It wasn't. I could still see his mangled face in my mind. It still haunted me, and now it was all too much. It was supposed to be final. I'd convinced him to avoid the woods. He'd protested, but I was adamant. I didn't want to go back there anytime soon, and I wasn't sure what I'd find there anyway. He was still smiling. It hadn't fallen once since he'd arrived at my house, and it wasn't getting any less unsettling. We were riding now into town. He said we'd go and pick up some food, then sit down somewhere and just hang. I looked back at him again. He slowed to a stop. "Look at that." I turned and faced the other way. He was pointing at one of those missing posters that his mother, only a few days ago, had plastered up on every pole or wall around town. "What about it?" My voice hollowed, managed at least to blurt that out coherently enough. "Well, I don't know. It's weird how everyone thought I was missing for a week, right? Even my mom. It's not like her to forget." I furrowed my brow. Seeing that missing person poster at least meant that I wasn't going crazy, but still, I had to be cuckoo somehow. I mean, she even called the police, if you can believe that. I grunted. "But it's okay," he continued. "I told her about what happened, and she phoned them saying it was all right." I noticed I was slowing down, so I caught back up to him. As we rode further up the road past his house, we both slowed as we approached the window. My eyes involuntarily drifted toward it. I looked, and, after Josh waving, we both saw his mother grinning and waving back, her head moving between two people. Two people. I stopped suddenly. He stopped too and looked at me in confusion. I tried to think about how to ask this. I didn't want to be too direct, but I still needed to know the truth. Listen, Josh. I looked at him. He nodded. What did you mean when you said your mom forgot? He started chuckling and seemed to relax a bit. Well, it's the funniest thing. He leaned in closer towards me. She somehow doesn't remember me driving up to the camping spot last Tuesday. Isn't that mad? I blurted an affirmation. Tuesday. That was the day after I killed him. I pressed further. Do you remember what happened last Monday? His grin stopped for a moment and then returned. Well, come on, of course I remember. You do too, right? In the woods? He chuckled and started riding again. I joined him, dumbfounded. I tried to push it to the back of my mind, as difficult as that was, and pretended everything was fine. We stopped off at the chip shop, picked some food up, and rode up to the park just as we would do often. It was really odd. It wasn't the fact he was back from the dead that freaked me out. It was the fact he was acting. He was like this normally, stupidly positive, and before, that was something that was good things were always fun with, but now it was creeping me out. And the fact he seemed to know what I did to him as well. Does he know I killed him? We sat and ate in silence. I couldn't think of anything to say, and he seemed to be perfectly content eating his chips, so I didn't feel a need to say anything. After a few minutes, he finally spoke. What have you been up to in the last week, then, while I was gone? He paused, smiling. Camping? Camping? I found myself mutter. Yeah, of course. I messaged you last week about it. Don't tell me you're forgetting, too. His teeth chomped down on another chip. I felt for my phone. I hadn't gotten a text from him. I knew that. I had spent the first few days after I'd killed him constantly rereading our last conversation. I unlocked my phone. Josh still happily eating and navigated to our messages. I read our last conversation. It was on Sunday. I breathed a sigh of relief. It didn't happen. Josh stopped eating and looked at my phone. He grabbed it out of my hands. Why are you up here? He chortled. Look, you have to scroll down, you knob. He scrolled the chat down and then thrust the phone into my face. I read what it said. Monday, 12:10 p.m. Josh. Oi, Dan, listen. I'm going camping tomorrow. Can't remember if I told you or not. I swallowed. I'd never seen that text before. He frowned suddenly and looked back at my phone. Oh, look, he said. I didn't scroll far enough. He fumbled with it for a second and then placed it into my hands. He turned away and continued eating. I looked and focused down at the phone. It was the most recent message, on Monday last week at 12:12 p.m. It said, Mate, why do you never invite me to these things, lol. Anyway, hope you have fun, bro. I chuckled nervously for a split second and then stopped myself. The text is from me. I looked at Josh, keeping eye contact with him while slowly turning my phone off and placing it into my pocket. He wiped his greasy hands on his jeans and smiled. You gonna eat any of yours? I hadn't even touched my portion. I looked around the park for a second. The only exit was in front of us, in front of the bench. I looked back at Josh. Yeah, listen. I sprang to my feet and got onto my bike. As I started pedaling, I shouted to him, You can finish them. I turned my attention back to what was in front of me. I knew where I needed to go. I could hear him calling my name, no doubt getting on his bike and chasing after me. But I knew what I needed to do and where I needed to go. But first of all, I had to lose him. As I left the park gates, I immediately turned left into an alley and then turned right. I continued straight ahead for a while. Before turning out back onto the main road, I was heading towards the woods. I slowly turned and looked around. I couldn't see him. I didn't know how close he was, but he didn't have line of sight to me, which was something. I gritted my teeth and entered into the woods. I still remember the route we went through that day. It wasn't a particularly difficult one, as it was mainly a straight line with a hard left turn, and the landmarks along the route were distinct enough for me to remember easily. And when I got there, my suspicions were confirmed. The body and the bike was still there, exactly as I left it. It was rotting now. I gagged and looked away. So what is the Josh I was just eating chips with? I didn't know what to do. I could point the body out to the police. That would work. An autopsy would say that the body was rotting for a week. That would prove that the Josh that was still alive was some kind of fake, but would they then realize that it was me? I didn't know what to do. I wanted to turn it in. Don't do that. I turned around. Josh was stood next to his bike, about maybe 10 meters away from me. He wasn't smiling anymore. How did you... What are you? I said, but he didn't answer. You're not going to tell the police anything, he said. I'll be back up here in a bit to sort all of this out. What are you? I repeated. You let me live my life, and I'll let you live yours. We won't talk about this again. His voice was sounding oddly deep and raspy. Remember, it's what you did. I'll see you soon. But before I could respond, he was already far away. For years, I hated Valentine's Day. As a kid, I didn't mind it. Being an only child, my mom would spoil me whenever holidays rolled around. Valentine's Day was no different. She would get me stuffed animals, my favorite candy, and whatever new toy I wanted. As I got older, the magic had worn off for me. I never had a Valentine outside of my mom, so that day was always bittersweet for me. Yes, it was sweet to get things from my mom, but just like any teenager, I didn't value my mother going out of her way to always make sure I felt loved. It didn't help that my father was always saying how ridiculous Valentine's Day was. The greeting card companies take advantage of all the fools who are willing to spend their hard-earned money. I love your mother every day. Why do I need a specific day to show her? They hike up the prices of candy and flowers. It's a sucker's day. My mother never really seemed to mind my father's rant about it. She was just happy to give me my gifts and celebrate the day with me. It wasn't until I met my wife that I truly had a Valentine. I always made a big deal out of the day when it came to her. I suppose it was my mother that helped me to realize how to celebrate someone you love. I had just never experienced that until I finally met the love of my life. Well, I love celebrating the love I have for my wife and showing her just how much she means to me on that special day. She wasn't the biggest fan of it. Not the celebrating the love part. That wasn't the issue. It was the trauma from when she was a child. Her father had left her mother on Valentine's Day when she was a kid. In some dramatic fashion, he left a note telling her he couldn't fake the love anymore, and that Valentine's Day shouldn't be a pretend day in which we show love to each other. He had packed up overnight and started a new life in a different state. As you can imagine, this affected my wife throughout her life. Part of the reason I'm extravagant on that day is to not only rid the memory of her father leaving, but to assure her that she won't have to worry about me doing anything like that to her. Even though I was married, I never neglected my mother on Valentine's Day, especially in the recent years since my dad passed away. I always made sure to get her a dozen roses and even some chocolates. My mom always loved receiving them and would call me after the delivery surprise that I would do something so sweet.
Oh, thank you, honey. I was shocked to get a delivery on Valentine's Day. Who knew my little boy could be so sweet?
I could tell it meant a lot to her, and it was something she looked forward to. On that same surprise phone call, she would always say the same thing in regards to my wife.
How could someone not like Valentine's Day? With someone as sweet as you by their side, it wouldn't hurt to show some appreciation.
I would always tell her the same thing. Ma, it's always a lot for her to deal with. Her father really messed her up when she was a little girl, so this time of year is always rough for her. She appreciates everything I do for her, and my goal is to just help her to forget that horrible memory just for the day. This year for Valentine's Day, I had something even bigger planned. Flowers, card, candy, dinner. That was always part of the deal. But this year I was going to recreate our proposal/wedding. I rented out a big hall for all our family and friends to attend. I wanted to create a new core memory for her on this day. I wanted her to forget about what happened all those years ago. Secretly, I had been planning this for months, making sneaky phone calls, contacting family and friends to be a part of it, coming home late from work to go see a florist, or stopping by the venue to make sure everything was in order. It was all going according to plan until about a week before Valentine's Day. I got home late again, and my wife was waiting by the door.
Where have you been? Do you think I don't know what's going on?
Huh? What are you talking about, honey?
Late from work again? Phone calls and secret texts to whoever it is you're talking to?
Oh, baby, you have this all wrong.
Save it. I'm not dumb. I won't have another man walk out of my life. I packed a bag and I'm going to stay with my mom.
I don't want to ruin the surprise, but I also wanted her to know I wasn't doing anything wrong. Wait. I'll tell you what's been going on.
No, you won't. I'm not listening. I need some space. I'm leaving.
Honey, I swear this is all a misunderstanding. She wouldn't listen. She slammed the car door before I could even spit out the truth. She had been at her mother's house for a few hours before she finally picked up my phone calls. I'm coming to your mom's now. I'm going to tell you what's been happening. I arrived at her mother's house and I spilled the beans. I explained to her exactly what I had been doing. She looked dejected. I can sense the guilt she felt. Instantly, she started to cry and apologize.
I'm sorry. It's just...
I know, honey,
Can I ask you something?
she said through crying eyes. Yes, of course, anything.
Is it possible for you to cancel this? This day is just hard for me. I can only imagine the effort you put in, but I don't think this is a day I can ever be happy about. I just don't want to celebrate anymore.
What could I do? Tell her no? That we have to go through with it no matter how miserable the day makes you feel? I could still get my money back, and nobody was traveling from far away, so I'm sure if I told them in time, it wouldn't be a big deal. I will cancel it, baby. I'll be here for you, whatever you need. We won't celebrate it anymore. I love you. Valentine's Day was here. My wife and I had been on great terms since that terrible misunderstanding, and as she wished, we weren't celebrating. We had dinner like we normally would, we laughed, we played some games, and we watched our show. It was nice to see her relaxed and feel no pressure about the day. These last few days, my focus was on her and making sure to keep her head clear, because that's what you do when you love someone. You're there for them and support them in their time of need. We had went to bed that night without even mentioning Valentine, and we were happy, and that's all that mattered to me. It was the middle of the night when my phone rang. The caller ID read, "Mom." "Hello?" I said with a tired voice.
So that's it? No flowers, no candy? Do I mean nothing to you?
I'd completely forgotten to set up my annual delivery of flowers and candy with everything that had been going on at home. What? I'm sorry, Mom. We've been going through a lot here. I literally just completely forgot.
Oh, did you just forget? After all the years I raised you? After everything I've done? I have no one in my life, and now you just forget about me. It's all about your unappreciative wife now, huh?
Mom, relax. I forgot. I'll make sure you get a delivery tomorrow.
Screw you and screw your bitch of a wife.
She hung up. I sat there in shock. My wife had woken me up and asked who I was on the phone with. I told her it was my mother and that I had forgotten to send her flowers and candy like I do every year. She was surprised that she called in the middle of the night, but reassured me that everything was going to be fine.
This is my fault. You were doing this for me. I'll make sure your mom gets some flowers and candy tomorrow.
I couldn't sleep for the rest of the night. I was shocked and pissed that my mother would speak to me that way. The way she spoke about my wife was like she was holding in hatred for her. I needed to talk to her today. I was going to call her when I got home from work. Imagine my surprise when I saw my mother's car in front of my house when I got home from work. I hesitantly walked inside. Hello?
Hi, honey. Your mom is here. She dropped by some apology cookies. You gotta try them. They're delicious.
My wife said with a smile and laugh as she walked in the kitchen to get the cookies.
Hi, son. I truly am sorry for calling you in the middle of the night and speaking to you the way I did. You didn't deserve that.
Mom, you don't know how much I needed to hear that. I am sorry I forgot. Things have been so crazy here.
I can only imagine.
That's when I heard a commotion in the kitchen. I ran to see what it was. My wife was on the floor, the tray of cookies all around her. I ran over to her. She was foaming at the mouth. What the... Baby, what happened? I dove to the floor trying to help her. Did she need CPR? Was she choking? The gurgling sounds would not stop coming from her. Mom, call an ambulance. Mom, right now, call an ambulance. I don't know what's wrong. Mom? That's when I felt a hand on my shoulder. My mother knelt down next to me and whispered in my ear.
I am your forever Valentine.
I have suffered with sleep paralysis since I was a child. Through all of my years of dealing with this, I have had some truly horrific experiences. However, the one I had a couple of days ago has been the worst one yet. I woke up not feeling the greatest. I was up a few hours, and after not feeling much better, I decided to lay back down and try to nap it off. I was turned on my side, facing away from our bedroom door on the far side of mine and my husband's king-sized bed. I felt my body relax, and I fell asleep rather quickly. Next thing I remember is slowly opening my eyes and seeing our bedroom wall and the door that leads to our bathroom, as the bathroom door was closed. I then tried to move and couldn't. As I've been through this many times, I was already mentally telling myself I was in sleep paralysis and I needed to focus on trying to move a little, such as wiggling my fingers, a tip I learned online. However, I'm already feeling scared and I can feel my heart racing. I then hear the sound of our bedroom door open and close behind me, as our bedroom door makes a very loud and distinct popping noise. I immediately thought it was my husband coming in to check on me, and thought he'd be able to get me to snap out of this horror. That thought quickly vanished as I heard heavy stomping running around the bed until they stopped directly in front of me, and I see a very large and tall black figure standing in front of our bathroom door. This is the same figure I encounter in almost all of my sleep paralysis experiences. I can never make out any features. Before I can register any other thoughts, the large figure lunges at me. I feel the heavy weight of this thing on my body, and it feels like it's crushing me, especially in my ribs. As previously mentioned, I'm still laid on my side with both of my arms pulled up, and my hands are tucked under my pillow. By now, I've closed my eyes, and I'm trying so desperately to move. That's when I felt teeth burying into my ribs. I don't know how to truly describe the awful feeling. It's an intense feeling of pressure, pain, and almost a tickling sensation, and it's one of the worst things I've ever felt. At this point, I'm trying to thrash away and trying to scream, but I'm still completely paralyzed, and I feel like I have no air left in me, and I never am able to make a sound. I can literally feel this thing's mouth opening and closing in different spots along the side of my ribs. At this point, I'm mentally screaming and pleading to snap out of it. Next thing I know, I'm straight up in bed. My heart is racing. I'm broke out in a cold sweat and I can still feel tingles in my ribs on my left side. After my eyes dart around the room and I find it to be completely empty, I lift up my shirt to inspect my side. The skin is not broken, but the whole left side of my rib cage is bright red. I've done a good amount of research on sleep paralysis and I understand the scientific explanation for it, but waking up with physical marks from these experiences is brand new to me. I have a ton of anxiety when it's bedtime ever since this experience. I have truly come to understand no sleep. I never understood why some people leave their doors slightly open. Maybe it's carelessness. Maybe it's some weird kind of trust in the world. Or maybe, just maybe it's a trap. I work as a bike courier in a big city. I mostly deliver food, but sometimes it's small packages or documents. Usually it's simple. Show up, knock, hand over the package, leave. But last week I got an order that still keeps me up at night. It was late, almost 10 p.m. when the app sent me to an older apartment complex. The building was run down, graffiti on the walls, flickering hallway lights. I climbed the stairs to apartment 4B, where I was supposed to deliver the package. The door was already open. Not fully, just a crack. Just enough to see that the light was on inside. I hate when customers do this. So I knocked and called out, "Hello? Delivery for you." No answer. I called out again, louder this time. Nothing. I thought about just leaving, but then I noticed something strange. Right next to the door, on the floor, was a pair of shoes, perfectly aligned as if someone had placed them with a ruler and a spirit level. I don't know why, but that unsettled me more than the open door. A weird feeling crept into my stomach. I should have just left, but instead I stepped closer and knocked again, this time directly on the door. It slowly swung open. The apartment was unsettlingly sterile. No decorations, no personal belongings. The furniture was old and worn, but everything was perfectly arranged. The walls were bare, no pictures, no shelves, and directly across from the door in the hallway stood a camera on a tripod. The lens was pointed at me. I felt my neck tense up. "Hello?" My voice sounded too loud, too foreign. Nothing. I thought about just setting the package down and getting the hell out of there. Then I heard it, a faint scraping sound from somewhere inside the apartment. Someone was in there. My instincts screamed at me to leave, but my feet didn't move. I strained to listen. The sound came from the bedroom, and then I noticed something even more disturbing. The apartment didn't smell like anything. No perfume, no food, no human scent. Just sterile, empty air. The scraping got louder. I took a step back, my eyes darting around the room, and that's when I saw it. The bathroom door was slightly ajar. Through the tiny gap, I could see an eye. Someone was standing there completely still, watching me. My breath caught in my throat. Then, a sharp creak behind me. I spun around. The apartment door, which I had left open, was now shut. I didn't think. I grabbed the handle, yanked it open, and ran. I bolted down the stairs, heart pounding, head spinning. I didn't stop until I was on my bike, pedaling away as fast as I could. Only when I was a few blocks away did I dare to look back. In the window of apartment B, a figure stood motionless, staring down at me. I never reported it to the police. I wouldn't even know what to say. But ever since that night, I feel like someone's watching me. Always. I'd been living in the old Victorian for 6 months when I first noticed the flies. They congregated in the corner of the study, a fist-sized stain on the faded Persian carpet that seemed to pulse with them. No matter how many times I sprayed insecticide or laid traps, they returned, droning, persistent, their bodies glinting like obsidian beads in the sunlight. The previous owner had warned me the house had quirks, but this felt deliberate, as though the stain was so delicious to them that they couldn't help but gather there. One sweltering July afternoon, I snapped. Screw it, I'll just replace it. I mumbled as I tore the carpet up with a crowbar. Sweat dripped down my neck as I removed the culprit section of the carpet. Beneath the moth-eaten fabric was a patch of warped hardwood covered in maggots. Its edges blackened as if scorched. What the? I said to myself in disgust. A single floorboard sat slightly raised, like a crooked tooth. I pried it loose with the crowbar, half expecting to find human remains underneath, but instead there, in the hollow beneath, lay a book. It wasn't like the gothic grimoires from movies. This was small, kind of like those pocket Bibles you find in hotel rooms. It was bound in cracked suede, the color of dried blood, and its pages were yellowed and brittle. The symbols inside weren't Latin. They squirmed, shifting under my gaze like centipedes. Yet somehow I understood them. A chant whispered in my mind, sweet and coaxing. Speak me, and I'll make the flies go away. I laughed, a nervous, breathy sound. What harm could it do? That night, with a bottle of bourbon as my courage, I knelt over the floorboard hollow and recited the words aloud. The air turned syrupy, smelling of wet soil and rotting fruit. Then came the voice, smooth as oil, amused. Ah, a pragmatist. The man who materialized before me was ordinary, mid-30s, unshaven, dressed in a rumpled linen shirt and slacks. His eyes were the only oddity, pale green flecked with gold, like sunlight through a swamp. He gestured to the stain on the floor. Flies, right? Nasty business. Let's fix that. A snap of his fingers and the insects crumpled to ash. What are you? I stammered. A problem solver, he said, grinning. Call me Baz. And you, my friend, just earned yourself a favor. Over the next week, Baz became a fixture. He fixed the leaking roof, unclogged the septic tank, even brewed a mean cup of coffee. He joked about modern life, lamented the paperwork of his job, and never once mentioned demons or souls. To be honest, I actually kind of enjoyed his company, but after a few more days, I grew suspicious of his helpfulness, eventually driving me to ask what he wanted in return. Seriously though, Baz, why are you doing all of this? He waved me off. Consider it a housewarming gift, but if you're feeling generous, a little signature wouldn't hurt. He produced a simple receipt, no different from one you'd get from a convenience store. You see, I'm somewhat of a handyman, and all I need is a signature right here at the bottom. Standard stuff, acknowledgement of services rendered. I should have read it, but the flies were gone. The house was warm, finally mine. I scribbled my name. The moment the ink dried, Baz's skin split. His body erupted into a mass of writhing maggots, eyes boiling into pus-yellow orbs. Wings, translucent, veined, sprouted from his back, buzzing with the sound of 1,000 flies. The voice that emerged was a chorus of screams. Souls are so much sweeter when given, not taken. Beelzebub crooned, a clawed hand pressing over my chest. Coldness spread, my breath frosting in the air. Don't look so grim. You'll live a long, happy life until I come to collect. The flies flickered and he vanished, leaving the stench of sulfur. I tried to burn the grimoire. It wouldn't catch fire. Now, when I wake up at 3 a.m., I hear him laughing in the walls, a sound like broken glass and wings. The flies are back too, but now they follow me around. It's been 2 years since the last time I saw Baz, and I pray it was all just a bad dream. but just as I start to drift off to sleep, I hear a buzzing next to my ear. I hate flies. Before she died, my mother dispensed idioms with the mechanical consistency of a gumball machine. She offered them like pieces of stale wisdom. Their minimal flavor quickly faded. Even so, I found myself savoring them. I didn't want to relinquish the last sentiments she had given to me. Wash pots never boil, Mary. Two birds, one stone. Honey catches more flies than vinegar. At first, it was easy to pretend that the idioms were relevant to our conversations, but as she lost lucidity, they melded together and became unintelligible. Throw the baby out with the gift horse. It's time to bury the elephant in the room, Mary. I used to sit next to her in the nursing home and will myself to understand. Her tone was always urgent, her grasp fervent. She looked at me like she was begging me to comprehend nonsense. But even then, I suppose I knew what she was really telling me without voicing it. Words that I would not bear to hear even if she were capable of saying them. She was dying. Her jumbled idioms seemed to be all that remained of a once expansive vocabulary. She used to weave stories with language like a beautiful thread, and her tongue as a needle. But it was as if she forgot how to sew. I imagined her dementia burrowing into her brain, chiseling out words, leaving only rot in its wake. When her disease first manifested, I deluded myself. I became convinced I could slow her decline with the right materials. I brought her daily newspapers until the incident happened. That day, I gave her the daily paper and a quick kiss on the cheek. I sank down in the stiff armchair at her bedside and shielded my eyes from the sunlight that streamed in from the window. I glanced at her veinous hands and saw them tremble. The paper shook with her convulsions. I felt every muscle in my body tense as she emitted a low, warbling moan. "Mom, what is it?" I asked. But her only response was to curl further in on herself. She clutched her ancient nightgown to her chest like a small child. My heart clenched. Terrified and confused, I reached out to comfort her, to take the paper away, but she broke down sobbing. "Don't cry over book covers," she whimpered. When I finally wrestled the tear-sodden paper away from her, I read the headline: Jerkins twins suspected to be 6th and 7th victims of backwoods butcher. After that, I only brought Debbie McComber novels, but the damage was done. She stopped reading not long after the newspaper incident. I watched the seasons change from her room's window. As the trees shed their leaves, resplendent shades of crisp golds and browns were carried away by the wind. As far as the eye could see, the tree skeletons' limbs were left to brace the cold. Without their armor, they looked defenseless and alone. My mother lost herself in much the same way. Day by day, the color bled from her life, her essence shed from her skin like so many dead leaves. In its absence, she was carved bare, until only a dull, unrecognizable hole remained. I tried to search her face for any semblance of selfhood, but her skeleton leered as if mortality were staking its claim. Flesh clung to her jaw and hung in jowls like the last vestiges of life clung to her frame. She was my mother, and she was death incarnate. I found that I could not look at her for long. I stared hard at the floor, my hands, the door, anywhere but the unfamiliar gaze from the sockets sunken in my mother's face. When she sensed that my gaze had shamefully slid away, she sometimes snarled at me. Watched pots never boil. Her frail fingers would dig into my wrist and leave imprints in my skin. I could feel her urging me to look at her, to see her diseased eyes and wispy hair and paler skin. This is my confession, so I can admit it was hard to visit her in the end. I found excuses to leave as early as I could, or better yet, to never come. I hated the twisted, repetitive idioms that she upheaved like a sickness. I hated the bleached smell of the nursing home. Most of all, I hated sitting next to her as an unseen but pernicious force took more and more of her away. I knew she was dying. For months, I could see it etched in her face and hear it in the absence of things she couldn't say. But then why was I left so bereft when death came like a thief in the night? I should have been relieved for her suffering to end, but all I could hear were the last words she said as they bounced around in my head. "Mary," she uttered, 2 days before her end. "Better late than never." I didn't hear her speak again until long after she was dead. Her funeral came and went with little fanfare. A few of my friends came from work. Most of hers were already dead. Together, we listened as a pastor we had never met described a caring creator we had never perceived. When the time came, I sprinkled dirt on her casket and watched as the gaping maw of the earth swallowed her whole. Afterward, Ethan, Jade, Allison, Sam, Nick, and I all crowded around a small bonfire as February's cold sank her teeth in our skin. I drank more than I spoke. My friends carried the conversation. When it was time for the rest to leave, Ethan didn't. I sank into his arms that night, and every night since. 1 week passed without my mother's idioms, then 2, then 3. Several months came and went. When it rained, it was a pet-free downpour. I judged books by their covers and stared at pots just long enough for them to boil. I don't know why. I just know that I felt her absence acutely. So much so that the lack of her became its own presence. My mother met an end that she didn't deserve, and I couldn't find the justice in it. How was it fair for her to die alone in a nursing home, left with nothing but the few sentences she could string together, wilted flowers, and a book she could no longer read? Horribly, unforgivably, how was it fair that she became a burden to me, and I resented her for it? I hated sitting there, listening to her half of conversations decades in the past, a prisoner of her own mind, only ever lucid enough to hate me. Sometimes the grief rose and fell in crests and waves, and other times the anger ignited me. When I was angry, I would go home and set a full pot on a hot burner and wait, just like I used to sit and wait at the nursing home for her to say anything, do anything. I was good at passive participation. I sat and watched as time elapsed and bled the life from her eyes and the love from her heart. So I did it too, with the pots. I wish I could say I watched the water boil because I missed her, but I think the truth is that I was daring her, my own vengeful version of, "Look, Mom, no hands," a desperate, illogical call for her attention. But in all the times I called for her across a depthless void, I never actually expected her to answer. Until she did. I first heard her words from Ethan's lips after the fire. I guess I left the burner on for so long and so often that I became careless. Maybe I forgot to turn it off one night after I emptied the pot of boiling water. All I know is that my house went up in flames and little was left, save for ashes. After I lost everything, I was so relieved when Ethan invited me to stay with him. Of course I said yes. He had a charming bungalow out in the country on land his grandfather left him. Our casual fling quickly became a serious relationship. He brewed tea almost every night, and always prepared mine with plenty of honey. As my mother would say, living with Ethan was a silver lining. Or that's how it felt until she decided to join us. 2 weeks ago, my mother spoke to me, but I didn't know it at the time. As Ethan set my mug down on the coffee table, I looked into his deep blue eyes. "Thank you," I said. "Hey, do you mind grabbing a blanket?" "Sure thing, love." He brushed a curl behind my ear and walked to the doorway before suddenly turning back. He stood there in the doorway for a few minutes, unmoving, as if in a trance. I felt his eyes on me and raised mine only to meet his vacant stare. He was looking through me. His brow was furrowed. "I thought I told you watched pots never boil." The voice that left his lips was not his, nor was it hers. Not really. It was something else, inhuman, a death rattle wheeze that formed the shapes of words in the absence of inflection. I did not hear it so much as I felt it, a chill that twirled around my spine and tightened. I felt this entity and instantly became clammy and nauseous. I could not speak. My mouth was filled with ashes. Honey, are you okay? You look like you've seen a ghost. Ethan came out of it, crouched before me, and gently reached for my hands. Finally, my throat unclogged and words spilled out. What do you mean? Why did you say watched pots never boil? I said. I searched his gaze but only saw our shared confusion. I didn't say anything. Are you sure you're feeling okay? He inspected me with concern. I both believed him and didn't. I knew that those words couldn't be his. But then why did they leave his lips? At first, nothing came of it. I wish I could say that this was the end of it, but it was only the beginning. That voice. I heard that voice more times than I care to admit. The words were always my mother's, but the voice was not of this earth. It was devoid of humanity. It lacked light, love, or warmth. At times I believed that my mother was speaking to me across a great distance, and maybe the bone-chilling voice was interference. Other times I was convinced that Ethan was pranking me. It was easier and safer to think my boyfriend was an a-hole than it was to think we were being haunted by my mother. But even then, I could not shake my terror. Every day, just as my defenses lowered, that nauseating voice would surface from the grave of his lips and permeate the air. Hours ago it said, 2 birds, 1 stone. 2 birds, 1 stone. 2 birds, 1 stone. It was a chanting, and it was a condemnation. I could not hear the anger, but I could feel it, suffusing the words and contaminating our home. Ethan, what is going on with you? I pushed him in the chest and was shocked as his head cracked back against the wall. It was like his body went lax, like his form was hollow and the voice was an abscess. Let her off the hook. The words were carried by a rapid hiss from between his cracked lips. I shuddered as the temperature plummeted. Who? I choked out. I could feel the shift as Ethan returned to his senses. He rubbed his head. Mary, what happened? Why are you looking at me like that? Ethan, I can't. This isn't funny. You need to stop. I pleaded. Mary, I don't know what you're talking about. My head is pounding. I'm going to lay down for a minute, okay? Flabbergasted, I watched as he walked away and shook off the urge to beg him to stay with me. I needed to get to the bottom of the voice. If my boyfriend had a crappy sense of humor, then okay, but we would talk about it like adults. Things had gone too far, so I went in search of Tylenol for his headache. Like my mother always said, you catch more flies with honey than vinegar. I searched high and low in cabinets and drawers and turned up empty. It seemed like I found everything but Tylenol. I was almost ready to give up, but then I remembered his guest bathroom cabinet. I felt around inside a drawer when my fingers brushed against 2 thin metal chains. I pulled them out and held them up to the light. They were curious things. 2 thin strands, each with a single bird charm dangling. They looked familiar in a way I couldn't place. Did Ethan have family stay in this room? His mom or sisters? As I studied them, my heart began to race. 2 birds, 1 stone. Surely that was a coincidence. I wanted to put them back in the drawer, close it, and forget about it. But even as I thought it, I felt a compulsion to keep them. Some unknown instinct was nudging me almost imperceptibly. The necklaces looked so innocent. They reminded me of high school graduation gifts. I didn't believe they were particularly expensive, but I could tell they were treasured. The birds were smudged with blurred fingerprints, as if they had been rubbed continuously. With sudden clarity, I knew where I had seen them before. Of almost its own volition, I felt my hand reach for my phone in my pocket. I pulled it out, unlocked it, and stared at the home screen unblinking. I typed into the Google bar, Jenkins twins disappeared. My heart sank. The girls were gone, but their necklaces were still there. It couldn't be, could it? The necklaces were a perfect match to the ones the girls wore in the article's picture. Why else would Ethan have two identical necklaces in here? Frantically, I googled backwoods butcher. There had been 2 additional suspected victims since the day I gave my mother that paper. My mind raced as I searched for Ethan's alibis and came up empty. I wanted to scream. I wanted to call the police, but I needed to think. "Honey, where are you?" Ethan called from the hallway. I panicked and put the necklaces back in the drawer before closing it quietly. I was desperate to confront him, but my mother's words rang in my head. Let her off the hook. I thought about all the things she said, before and after she was dead. That whole time I thought she was stuck in conversations in the past. But what if she somehow knew about the future? Watched pots never boil. What if she knew about the fire? If I had paid more attention to the burner, then the fire would have never happened. 2 birds, 1 stone. I thought about the necklaces as nausea crept up my throat. Let her off the hook. My pulse raced. What does it mean? Is it literal? Who is she? And more importantly, where is she? Should I follow him to find out? I took this job because I needed the solitude. The fire lookout tower, perched high above the endless Montana wilderness, promised exactly that. A single-room cabin atop a skeletal frame of timber, swaying slightly in the wind, offering an unmatched view of the valleys below. It was beautiful in the daylight. At night, though, it was something else entirely. The first few days were uneventful. I settled into a routine, morning coffee on the deck, scanning the horizon for smoke, logging my observations. I read books, listened to the radio, and let the quiet sink into my bones. It was peaceful in a way I hadn't felt in years. The isolation wasn't just welcomed, it was necessary. By the 3rd night, I had grown used to the sounds of the forest, the rustling of trees, the distant hoot of an owl, the wind rattling the old frame of the tower. So when I first heard the tapping, I barely noticed it. Just the wind, I told myself. Maybe a bird pecking at the glass. Then came the whispers. They were faint at first, more like the suggestion of words than actual speech. I told myself it was my imagination, the wind flittering through the trees in just the right way. But as the night wore on, they grew more distinct, though I still couldn't make out what they were saying. On the 5th night, I finally saw it. I was writing in my logbook when I noticed a shape outside the window. At first it looked like a branch swaying, but then I saw the eyes. 2 pinpricks of reflected moonlight staring right at me. My stomach dropped. It was a face. And it was upside down. I froze. The lookout tower was nearly 60 feet off the ground. There was nothing to hang from, no way for anything to be up there. But there it was, peering in at me, mouth slightly open, its breath fogging the glass. I didn't move, didn't breathe. I wanted to believe it was a trick of the light, but the thing blinked. I scrambled back, knocking over my chair. The figure lingered, head tilting in an unnatural jerky motion. Then, without a sound, it dropped out of sight. The next morning, I found footprints in the dirt below the tower. They weren't human, they weren't even animal. They were elongated, twisted, like a person had been walking on all fours, but their limbs bent the wrong way. I called it in, but what was I supposed to say? That I saw something impossible? The dispatcher humored me, told me to log it, and suggested I might be tired. That night, I locked the door. I kept the lantern burning, even though it made shadows dance in the corners. Hours passed and nothing happened. Just the wind, the creak of the old wood, my own heartbeat in my ears. I almost convinced myself I had imagined the whole thing. Then, just past midnight, the whisper started again, closer this time. I clenched my teeth. refusing to acknowledge them. But then came the tapping. Not on the window this time, on the trap door beneath my feet. The only way up the tower was the staircase. The trap door was the last barrier between me and whatever was outside. The tapping turned to scratching, a slow, deliberate scraping of nails against wood. Then, the voice came, not a whisper anymore, a ragged, breathy mimicry of my own voice.
Let me in.
I squeezed my eyes shut, pressing my back against the far wall. The scratching stopped, silence pressed against me like a physical weight. Then, a single soft tap against the window behind me. I didn't turn around. I don't know how long I stood there frozen. When I finally did turn, morning light was creeping over the horizon. The window was empty. The forest was still. But I wasn't alone, because outside on the ground far below I saw them, dozens of figures standing among the trees staring up at me, and every single one of them was upside down. Then they moved, not like people walking, like puppets yanked by invisible strings. Their heads lolled, arms jerked unnaturally, but they were getting close, creeping toward the base of the tower. Then came the sound, deep, resonant, like wood groaning under immense pressure. The tower shuddered. Something was pushing against it. I could feel it swaying as the wood seemed to crack violently at every joint. It doesn't make sense why I did it, but I left. My feet were moving for the door while my brain screamed at me to stop them. It was as if I was stuck on autopilot, a helpless passenger watching the plane taking a nosedive to the ground. I grabbed my flashlight and wrenched the trapdoor open, descending the stairs 2 at a time. The moment my foot hit the forest floor, the things let out the most awful blood-curdling screams. I ran. The forest was a maze of darkness and shifting shadows. I could hear them moving, branches snapping, leaves rustling, their ragged breathing impossibly close. I didn't look back. I couldn't. Every instinct screamed at me to just run. Then I saw the road, a single narrow path cutting through the trees. I sprinted toward it, lungs burning, legs screaming in protest. The figures were right behind me, their movements erratic, inhuman. Then, headlights. A truck, a lone driver on an empty road. I ran straight into its path, waving my arms frantically. The vehicle screeched to a halt and the driver, an old man with wide, startled eyes, popped open the door. I didn't hesitate. I dove inside, gasping, screaming at him to drive. He didn't ask questions. He just hit the gas, tires kicking up gravel as we sped down the road. I risked one final glance out the back window. The figures had stopped at the edge of the road, standing motionless, watching us go. I made it home. I locked my doors. I haven't gone back to the forest. It's been weeks. But I know it isn't over, because as I sit here typing this at home, I hear a soft, familiar tap on the window behind me. I've been told that writing these events out might help me move on, but what finally prompted me to write this was a realization that the right person, the right horribly unlucky person will read this, and it will save them. In that sense, I now feel obligated to get this out there. I'll give you all some quick background. I'm from Colorado. Currently I'm working for a fintech startup. It's just another one hoping to get bought out by one of the big banks like Schwab or whatever. But it's good resume building, and I like my team. I was still in college majoring in comp sci at the time of this story. You'll have to check my page to see my gripe about getting ribbed by engineering majors and being surrounded by Adderall junkies. Anyway, I just completed my 5th semester, and it was winter break. I'm a big skier. Shocking, I know, but I wasn't exactly loaded either. My friend Reggie and I wanted to go on a skiing trip before graduating, so we did a lot of research. We got a great deal on this cabin near our favorite slopes, but we couldn't afford it ourselves, so we had to accept that a couple of random guys would also be staying there. We worked everything out, and the cabin owner contacted our new roommates. We texted back and forth, and on the phone, we liked them both for the most part. Their names were Preston and John, and they were both out of state. I enjoyed talking to them about their love of skiing and how this was all they could afford after a flight. However, I quickly soured on them when we finally got to the cabin. They were both the sort of Colorado tourists who wouldn't stop saying stuff like bagging a 14er, colorful Colorado, POW day, and more than once Preston referenced that stupid Lucifer statue. I already think all that crap is annoying from natives, but to hear two out-of-state guys talk like that was incredibly irritating. I also quickly remarked on their rude behavior. John was alright, but just wasn't well-mannered. But Preston especially seemed to have no filter for judgmental thoughts or complaints. As we were moving in, I kept hearing things like, "Bro, walk a little faster, it's not that hard," and "You're not gonna wear that deodorant this whole time, right?" I'm a lot more moderate than I should be most of the time, but still, after Preston said, "Hey, we're gonna smoke while we're here, and you two are just gonna have to be cool with that," Reggie and I lost our cool on him. His friend John wasn't much help. I don't think it was because he was avoiding conflict. I think he just knew we were right. We argued and yelled with each other for a while. Finally, we made it clear he wasn't going to smoke in the cabin. We didn't care that the owner already told me it's cool, bro, and he's not gonna say stuff if we smoke inside. Calm down, guys, it's literally not that deep. We didn't smoke, and we didn't want the smoke inside. There was some pushback, but when Reggie flat out said, "If you whip a bong out, I'll smash it," Preston gave us a dirty look and stormed off. John stood there awkwardly for a second. He gave us one of those looks that said, "I gotta agree with him, 'cause he's my friend, and I know you all aren't wrong." And then he walked off after Preston. The rest of the night was uneventful. Preston sulked in his room for a long time and loudly whined about us to his girlfriend on the phone, but John came down and pitched into the pizza order we were making. There's a great place up there we used to love to order from called Pin Dai Lumaca. Although, I'm not sure it's even still there. It could be gone, or maybe they knew too. Maybe they knew how to survive and just didn't bother warning anyone. Perhaps they're still there slinging 4-cheese pizzas, pretending nothing ever happened. Preston finally came down after the food was delivered. It got a kick out of John seeing the guy bring us our order on a snowmobile. It was a quiet and strained meal, but we all ended up chatting there. I still wasn't a fan of them at all, and Preston still couldn't quit saying all that tourist crap. He talked about loving the mile-high city, or something cliche like that, and I enjoyed hearing a little about their lives in Oregon, and about a couple of their skiing wipeout stories. Still, it was clear that we were talking just to keep the peace for the remainder of the stay. They didn't like us at all either. After dinner, Reggie and I put on one of those terrible Resident Evil movies we loved. One of the animated ones, and got our equipment ready in the living room. Preston and John had already returned to their rooms at that point, but I couldn't hear Preston complaining to his girlfriend anymore. I remember he came downstairs for water at some point. He stopped at the stairs and, mostly mumbling, he said, "Hey, there's literally no reason not to smoke in here, but I'm not gonna press it. I probably shouldn't have snapped or whatever. Good night." I appreciated the sentiment, but he still was an a-hole. We just brushed it off and got back to work. Finally, I went to bed and tried calling my mom before heading to bed. No reception at all. I know we were on a mountain, but still, it was weird. I asked Reggie, and he said he wasn't getting any service either. Again, odd, but not anything to worry about yet. I just went to bed, hoping the service would return in the morning. I woke up the following day and nothing around me was unusual at first glance. It was notably colder than last night. The heat was still on, but it was at least 5 degrees colder. I got out of bed to put my socks on, but I noticed it was still dark outside. I looked at my alarm clock. It said it was still early, but the sun was definitely up at this point. When my phone confirmed the time, I moved the curtains to the side to check. I tried to look out my window, but I was met with a wall of snow. I touched the window with my fingertips. It was completely frozen. I didn't know what to make of it. I was calm, we had some food, and the electricity was still on, so it wasn't immediately dangerous. But still, my bedroom was on the second floor. We'd been snowed up to the second floor at least. I know it's Colorado, and we were on a mountain, but still, this amount of snow was ridiculous, nearly impossible from what I've been told about the weather signals from that time. When I went to check my phone, I saw that I still had no service. At that point, I was unnerved, but still nothing too bad. I went downstairs to find Reggie and Preston discussing the snow. Reggie said something about digging our way out. Preston quickly shut him down. Nah, bro, we ain't getting through that. All you do is fill the living room with full of snow. He could have said it a little more politely, but I agreed. We were stuck for now. Nobody else was getting any signal either. I asked where John was. Preston started to say something. Oh, I mean, he's probably just sleeping in. He stayed up late too. Preston's eyes were caught by something beside the door. I followed his gaze, but I saw nothing. What's wrong? John went out to smoke last night. After we all headed to bed, he told me he was going to try some of his gear on and light up in the yard. Did you ever hear him come back? No, dude. I didn't go because I was already sleeping. He woke me up to ask, and then I passed back out. His boots aren't there anymore. We went upstairs and knocked on his room before finding no one there. Preston checked the basement and I checked the attic. Nothing. And what's worse is I found that the attic window was also blocked by snow. The snow was now piled up at least 28 feet. Nothing else was remarkable in the attic, just tools and leftover construction supplies. I found some PVC pipes in the corner, however. I had an idea. Reggie yelled up to me, so I put it off for later and headed back down the ladder and then down the stairs. He's not here. I felt bad for having felt so much hate for Preston the night before. He was sitting on the couch, clearly stressed the hell out, trying his phone and running his hands through his hair. We sat there and talked about what we could do. We agreed that it was getting colder, but we also decided that, unfortunately, it was probably best to turn down the heat. If it was still this cold with the heat up so high, we didn't want to blow the heating unit while we still had power. We turned it down from 70 degrees to 55. We ate just a little leftover pizza. It seemed we all understood the need to ration our food and sat there talking things over. But there's not much you can do or talk about in that situation. We all went our separate ways. Preston to his room, Reggie stayed in the living room, and I headed up to the attic. I found the PVC pipes from earlier. I took some out, measured them, and connected them. I got a ladder and climbed up to the attic window and cautiously tried opening it. I was relieved and slightly surprised that none of the snow fell in. I reached out and touched it with my hand. If it wasn't so cold, and I swear it was colder than snow typically is, then it would have been really pleasant to touch. It was so soft and malleable, like marshmallow fluff. It was still snow, but it was snow I'd never seen before, and I've never seen after. I pulled the PVC pipes up to the snow and started to push it straight up. I kept twisting and pushing through the snow until I quit feeling resistance. I pulled the pipe back down and measured the section I had left. It was 7.5 feet long, and the whole pipe was 20 feet long. The snow was about 12 feet above the window. It wasn't too shocking after everything else that had happened, but still, I was pretty nervous at that point. If more snow fell, how long would it be before the roof caved in? How long would it be before we got out? I was thinking all this over, and then I heard something odd. It was coming from the window. I looked up and realized the pipe had made a perfect hole through the snow. I heard some odd ambient noise out of this hole. It wasn't anything that was sticking out, but it sounded electronic almost. I took the PVC pipe down to the bathroom. used some warm water from the tube to get the snow out of the tube, and realized we needed to winterize all the faucets. I turned my faucets on a slow drip and got Reggie and Preston to do the same. If you don't put faucets on a slow drip in that kind of weather, then your pipes could freeze and bust. Anyway, I went back to the attic with the pipe. I carefully pushed the pipe back up through the hole I had made, which was surprisingly not caved in. After I knew it was through the top, I put my ear up to the hole and listened. I could try to explain the noise in great detail, but honestly, I could fill a whole other post by just doing that. All I need to say is that you'd be most of the way there if you imagine an electronic hum mixed with a pulsing high-pitched groan, pulsing in a random and organic way. Still, there was just so much to the sound. It's not like anything was horrifying about the sound itself, I suppose, but it just felt wrong. I felt unnerved, as if it were the wrong place. Or perhaps I was in the wrong place. I took the pipe back up and closed the window. I sat up there for a long time, thinking, trying my phone, and considering everything that could happen. I remember trying to come to terms with the reality that, given all the information I had at that time, I might starve to death or be crushed by the house caving in there. I thought about my family, how much I hadn't said to them, and about how much I hadn't accomplished. Trite, I know, but I just want to say that even though I was afraid to die, it felt very peaceful, since nothing was happening at that moment and I was managing to stay calm and accept what was happening, what I thought was happening. I just remember feeling very comfortable up there at that moment. Scared, yes, but relaxed. I eventually decided that I'd thought all I could and should about it. By the time I realized that, and by the time I was getting tired of sitting in a dusty attic, I realized it was pretty much time for bed. I went down and had a quick word with Preston and Reggie. They'd winterized their bathrooms, but they still didn't have any service. We all went to bed. I remember that when I woke up, the clock said 12:40 a.m. I heard something. It wasn't the odd hum I'd heard earlier. It was a tapping sound coming from my window. I sat there frozen in bed. I was just coming off my tired brain state, but it would have scared me even if I weren't. We were snowed entirely up to the roof. What was tapping on the window? I'd closed the curtains at this point to avoid seeing the wall of snow any longer. Cautiously, I got up and tried to peek through the end of the curtain to see what it was. It was a bird. I switched on my light and opened the curtain slowly. It was a small bird. It was green, emerald green, all over the body, but its head was mostly yellow until there was a circle of red around its beak. Its beak was thicker and curved down, from what I remember. It just kept tapping on the glass over and over. There was a small hole behind it where it had burrowed down, around 20 feet, through the snow. I couldn't believe it. It was shivering and flapping against the window trying to get inside. I felt terrible for the little guy, but it was still freaky. I turned around to quickly get Reggie and Preston to see what they thought about it. When I touched the doorknob, it was so cold that when I retracted my hand, it stuck to it painfully for a second. I tried getting a sock to turn the knob, but it wouldn't budge. It was as if the door was completely frozen. For a second, I feared that the snow had caved in through the roof, and I was completely trapped in my room. But I could see the hall light glow through the bottom of the door. The bird began to tap on the glass again, more feverishly than before. I don't know what it was, but I felt so bad for it. I think the sentimentality of everything, the possibility of death, the disappearance of John, and all that I might never do, was getting to me. I barely opened the window, just enough to let the bird enter. It immediately flew over to sit on top of the open door to my closet. It was still shivering, so I got an extra blanket and put it on top of the heated blanket I had brought with me. When I went to try the door again, I heard wings fluttering. I looked back and the bird had buried itself in the nest I had built for it. It closed its eyes and fell asleep. I remember feeling good about that. like I had really done something right. I had. I hovered my hand over the top of the doorknob, still frozen. The nest was on the floor and the window was closed back now. Unfortunately, I didn't bother to close the curtains again. When I returned to bed to try to go back to sleep, I finally looked at the clock again. It still said 12:40 a.m. The old analog clock on the wall said 12:40, my phone said 12:40, and the digital alarm clock I'd brought said 12:40. I may not have had service, but my phone's clock and the others were working perfectly fine before. It was all very disconcerting. I suppose none of that was immediately threatening. However, I was already under the impression that something else was going on besides just a freak snowstorm after I heard the humming. Now with the bird, the frozen door, and the clocks crashing out on me, I could not sleep for a while. However, after about an hour, the clock started working again. My little friend suddenly hopped out of his nest and flew to me. I felt as frozen as the door was earlier in that moment. The bird rested itself on my chest, with me still looking down, and cried out at me, raising its wings, and finally, it pecked me on the chest. When its beak made contact with me, I felt a sudden cold rush through my whole body. Imagine the feeling of eating an Altoid and then drinking ice-cold Sprite. Now imagine you feel that through all of the veins in your body, but I was able to move again. It then jumped up and flew over to my door, pecking at it after making the same dramatic cry. After all this, it just flew back to its nest, but it didn't sleep. It just sat there watching me. I got up and hovered my hand over the knob again. Nothing. I lightly tapped on it with the back of my arm, not frozen at all. It wasn't even residually cold now. I looked puzzled at my friend, but it was still just staring at me. I walked out in the hall. Reggie had just come out as well, and he was inspecting the lock on the door with a confused look before he saw me. Was your door frozen for like an hour? Yeah, it was. I walked over and inspected his doorknob with him, and there was no residual cold either. Our voices attracted Preston, and he came out to talk to us. My door was frozen too. Did you guys have a bird pull up to your window? I was shocked when Reggie confirmed, and then I did too. Yeah, weird, right? I chimed in. Did you two let the bird inside? They both gave me an odd look. Reggie chimed in first. I felt bad for the poor thing, but I'm not just gonna let a bird enter the cabin. Birds can carry diseases and all that. It was trying to get in the whole time my door was frozen. It only just now stopped. Is it still there? Reggie peered back at his window with a sad, concerned look. I hope not, but I closed the curtains, so let me check. We all shuffled into his room. The poor thing was lying on its back when he pulled back the curtain. It had frozen to death, and it was the same species as mine. I couldn't help wondering how it hadn't frozen to death while burying down through the snow in the first place. But in retrospect, logic wasn't valuable at that point. Preston was the first to break the silence. Dang, I mean, why didn't it just leave? A bird came to my window, and I just smacked the glass to scare it off. And it left? Yeah, it turned around and returned from the hole it had come from. I'm not letting it crap all over my room. I let mine come in. They both looked shocked. Why? I don't know, man. I felt bad for it. Is it still there? Yeah, I'll show you. We began walking towards the bedroom door, but then we heard something, a thud on the glass. We turned back around to see a thin, dark green hand against the glass. It was thin and withered, and it didn't have veins. It had 5 fingers like a person's hands, but they were all crooked in odd, painful-looking ways. It was almost reptilian. We all watched in silence as the hand dug down through the snow to the little tunnel where the bird had dug for itself. The hand delicately picked up the tiny corpse and pulled it back up through the snow. There were only a few seconds of silence after this before it all started. Another hand suddenly dug through and smacked against the window, and then another, and another until, in just a few seconds, at least 20 different hands were slapping against the glass. Preston yelled out, "Come on, let's get down." Before he could finish that sentence, all of the hands, their numbers still growing, pushed against the glass, and it shattered open. After that, hundreds more hands flooded the room behind those originals. They went straight for Reggie. Oh God. He tried to turn around to run, but all the hands caught him. In one horrifyingly quick and brutal movement, they picked him up and smashed and tore him open. He only screamed for about a second. Preston and I, now covered in blood splatter and bits of organs, ran out into the hall. Preston was ahead of me when I tripped on the hall's carpet. He managed to reach the stairs and quickly ran down them. As I was falling and taking all of this in, as best as possible in such a panicked state, I heard more windows smashing. All the hands were flooding out of Reggie and Preston's rooms. When I saw them all advancing upon me, all I could do was scream louder than I thought I could, but they suddenly stopped when they were all only a few feet from me. I saw all of them that were closest to me suddenly freeze in such a way that it was as if they'd been plugged into liquid nitrogen. It barely seemed to faze them. The horde jumbled up, hesitating for a moment, perhaps as a reaction to the pain or in surprise. But then the injured hands in front were replaced by fresh ones, if you could have called hands that grotesque fresh. They flew past me and plunged down the stairs. Trailing behind them were impossibly long, sickly arms. I heard a yelp from below, and when I was trying to get back to my feet, I saw that they were quickly retracting. They had dragged Preston back up the stairs. He was yelling in such a chilling pitch. I'll never truly forget it. I tried to move to the side to avoid the hands myself, but as Preston was being dragged back towards his room, he grabbed my ankle. "Help me." I fell back over and went flying off towards his room with him. However, I barely managed to catch a hold of the door frame and hold us there for a few moments. "Let go. Don't let it take me. Pull up. I can't, man. Let go." I was slipping. God, the horror I felt when I realized I was slipping was sickening. But still, I remember realizing that the hum I heard earlier was present, and it was so much louder now. As I was losing a pinky on my grip, I saw the birds from my room fly in and perch on Preston's hand. It pecked away a few times. I heard his hands singe like the thing's hands had with me. Preston let go. I heard his screams for only another couple of seconds before he was dragged completely back out of the room and through the snow to God knows where. Then it was quiet. I heard that same terrible hum, but everything was still now. I was trying to catch my breath, but everything got to me. I passed out. I don't know for how long I was out for, but I guess it was an hour or two. But when I awoke, I saw everything still as it was. I was still covered in blood. The room was still a broken mess with shards of glass everywhere, and I was alone. But then I came to a little more. My friend perched on the window and staring at me. Behind him, I saw that the snow had melted. It had melted down to the point where a thin layer of sunlight was visible through the window again. The hum was gone. I wanted to say something to the bird, but I couldn't open my mouth. It gave me a final chirp before it hopped up, squeezed through the top of the window, and flew away. I laid there for a long time, but I realized I needed to pull some glass shards out of my skin. I got up gingerly and made my way to my room, turning my neck so I didn't have to see Reggie's room. It was fine. The window was still intact, and behind it, I could almost see the snow melting in real time. It took a while, but I managed to get all the little shards of glass out, and I washed all my wounds as best I could, with rubbing alcohol. I just started crying and screaming. I think I threw up a little bit. I just sort of crashed out in there for a while, as best I could, without moving my injured body too much. I still get little flashes of the horror of it all sometimes, but that first reaction was the worst of it all. When I finally realized I couldn't just sit in there crying for the rest of the day, I got up to check my phone. It had service again, and there were lots of missed calls and bad weather advisories. I could tell you in detail what happened afterward, but that's not important. So much happened, but I doubt it would be interesting or valuable to any of you. Police came, but they seemed pretty shaken up too. Over the next few days, I remember going to the hospital, having lots and lots of phone calls, and realizing I was one of the few to survive. After 4 days, I was back home. I remember some men in suits came and sat down with me at my apartment. They were very friendly, and they acknowledged everything that had happened. But they still loosely explained why the story just didn't work for the public and business in general, as they put it. They had me sign for a very large check, and the story to this day is that a freak avalanche occurred and that Preston and John died on the mountain while a bear got in to attack me and Reggie. I think about it all sometimes. Mostly, I just try not to worry about it and move on. But it just strikes me how unfair it all was. All Reggie did was avoid getting some bird flu or something like that. And Preston was a jerk, fair enough, but he was just doing the same thing, albeit rudely. I've asked pastors and philosophers these questions, but they never seem to have the correct answer. Why is it that so many people make the biggest decision at the worst time? Why is it that people have to make a choice that decides their fate for years to come? Perhaps the outlook of the rest of their lives? So often when they're at their least experienced. What if Preston was just a bit older? A bit more mature and kind? What if Reggie had just thought about it more and decided to let the bird in? Why was letting a bird come in the deciding factor? Maybe it's foolish to demand logic from such a violent and alien force, but I can't help thinking about it. I know I might be breaking the rules of my agreement, but I'm hoping that I can avoid any legal issues by changing names and not being too specific. This may never reach the right person, but it's been good for me to tell this story, and it may help someone somewhere. You may not believe this story, but that's fine. You'll probably never have to worry about it. But if you find yourself snowed in, snowed up to the roof, and you see a bird at your window, let it in. Please just let it in. My grandmother died when I was 6. About a week later, I realized something very important. It was by accident. We were in the living room. I was on the floor playing with my dolls and wishing my mom would play with me. Mom was seated on the couch, staring at the wall. She hadn't been talking much to me since grandmother died or doing much of anything. I looked up at my silent mom, opened my mouth, and without knowing why, I said, "Grandmother says you should play with me." The response was wonderful. Mom's eyes widened and she looked at me, straight at me, seeing me. She got off the couch and knelt by me, hugged me and exclaimed, "Oh, my darling daughter, grandmother said that to you?" And then burst into sobs, her face wet with tears. She picked up my doll and began moving it along the floor. After that, I knew that Mom would listen when grandmother asked her to do something. It was like grandmother had never died, when she used to make Mom give me a cookie. It must have been a month after that, and I just remembered something that grandmother had told me. I turned to Mom, opened my mouth, and said, "Grandmother said Aunt Viola was such a pretty child, such a pity she became fat." Again, I got a wonderful response. Mom's eyes widened with shock. She knelt down by me, her eyes fully on me, and said, "Maya, how could you have known that? When did grandmother say this to you?" I blinked. I couldn't remember well, and the look on Mom's face was a bit scary. Maybe grandmother said it to me those days I used to stay with her, when Mom was working. Mom would leave me with her at 2 and pick me up later when I was sleepy. Grandmother used to talk about fatness a lot, or maybe she said it some other time. "Yesterday," I said. "She said it to me yesterday, when we were at the park looking at fat children." Yes, that must be right. Mom and another woman were talking about fat children, like grandmother used to. Mom hugged me so tightly, that I felt like my breathing would stop. Her tears felt warm on my neck and made my t-shirt damp. "Oh, my precious daughter," sobbed Mom. Mom told Viola what I had told her, and she asked me to tell Aunt Viola herself. "Look, Viola, I told you." "Mother is talking to us through Maya. Tell her. Maya, tell your aunt what grandmother told you." I remember so well, looking at my mother and my aunt, their shining, desperate eyes. I opened my mouth and repeated, "Grandma told me you were such a pretty child, Aunt Viola. Such a pity you became fat." Aunt Viola cried out as if punched, clapping her hand to her mouth. Mom beamed proudly at me, her special daughter who could talk to grandmother. Everyone knew I was special because I could talk to grandmother who told me things. My cousins treated me respectfully after that, even though I was the youngest, and even my uncles nodded at me when they came over for family dinner. My cousins tried to make me say other things I had heard from dead people. I would start to say something, but then Mom and Aunt Viola told them off. "It's not a party trick. Stop bothering Maya." And then one day, when I was 10, one of my cousins, actually my favorite cousin, Arya, told me that her father hurt her. I knew I had to stop it. After all, wasn't I special? And wasn't Arya the nicest to me? I waited for the next family dinner. Then I opened my mouth and spoke up. "Uncle," I said clearly. The voices fell quiet. Everyone knew that tone meant that grandmother had a message for someone. "Uncle," I repeated. "Grandmother said you need to stop hurting my cousin." There was silence. Uncle made a sort of noise. So did Mom. Then I gasped. It was like I couldn't breathe. I cried out, clutching my throat. The air rippled and heaved. Through the thick, darkening air, I could see everyone's face blurry, staring at me, not moving. I gasped again, and my throat seemed to close up, and I felt like I had the worst possible sore throat. For a flash instant, I saw grandmother in the darkness that was closing in on me. I was trying to scream, but no sound came from my mouth. Then it was over. I opened my eyes, standing very still at the dinner table, holding on to the back of my chair. My throat was still very sore, but the unbearable pain had passed. I made a noise, but no words came out. After that dinner, I could never speak again, and even after I learned to communicate with no voice, I never, ever talked about grandmother and grandmother's children ever again. My cousin Arya and I left our family home when we could, and we never went back. I don't know why I'm even writing this. Maybe I just need someone to believe me. Maybe I need to get it out of my head before it eats me alive. There's a town that shouldn't exist. It's not on any map. No records. Nothing. Just a name whispered between truckers and late-night travelers. Black Hollow. No one plans to go there. It just shows up. If you're ever driving down Route 29 past midnight, you might see a road that wasn't there before. A cracked asphalt path winding into the fog, with an old wooden sign barely holding on. The letters are faded, peeling, but if you look close enough, you'll see it. "Welcome to Black Hollow." I made the mistake of taking that road. I was driving through the back roads, running low on gas, GPS acting up. It was one of those nights where the world feels empty, where you go too long without seeing another pair of headlights, and it starts messing with your head. Then I saw it, the turnoff. A gas station's neon glow barely visible through the fog. I figured, why not? Fill up the tank, grab a coffee, keep moving. But as soon as I turned onto that road, something felt off. The air got thick, like it was pressing down on me. The fog swallowed my car whole, my headlights barely cutting through. My radio crackled, then died. Then my phone screen glitched out. That should have been my first warning. The town looked frozen in time. Rows of old houses, a diner, a gas station, but no streetlights, no sound, just stillness. Yet the gas station lights were on. I pulled in, relieved, but the place was empty. No attendant, no cars, no sound. The pumps were ancient, the kind with rolling numbers instead of a screen. And then I heard it, a whisper right behind me. I spun around, heart hammering. Nothing, just my own shadow stretching too long under the flickering station light. I hurried inside. The bell above the door jingled, but the store was empty. Shelves were stocked, but covered in dust. It was like everything had been waiting for someone to show up. And then I saw the newspaper on the counter. Black Hollow missing again. Town disappears for 30th year in a row. The date? Exactly 1 year ago. My stomach dropped. I turned to run, and that's when I saw them. Figures standing outside watching me. Their faces weren't right, blurry like looking at a reflection in broken glass. My pulse pounded in my ears. The store lights flickered, and for a split second I saw their faces clearly. They weren't strangers. They were people I'd seen before, on missing posters, on the news, faces of people who had vanished, and then the lights went out. I don't remember running to my car, but I must have. My tires screeched as I tore down that road, the town stretching on like it didn't want to let me go. The fog thickened, twisting like it was alive, and then I saw the sign again, but this time the words had changed. Welcome to Black Hollow. You can check in, but you can't check out. Then, blackness. I woke up on the side of Route 29, my car parked neatly on the shoulder, gas tank full. My phone worked again. The time on the dash, 12:30 a.m. Like nothing had happened. But when I got home, I checked the missing persons reports. And there in the latest update, my face. It had only been a few hours since I left that town, but the report said I had been missing for a year. I don't know how much time I lost in that place, but I know one thing for sure. Black Hollow is real, and it's still out there waiting. I should have never turned down that road, so if you're ever driving on Route 29 past midnight, keep going, because if you see the turnoff, it means Black Hollow has already chosen you. Whenever I tell this story, I always start it in the same way. I don't care if anyone believes me. Either you do, and so you can empathize with me, or you don't, so you think I've created this terrifying experience out of thin air. Either way, it doesn't matter to me. This story is completely true. There is something stalking the mesquite thickets of East New Mexico. Several years ago, I was working at a dude ranch in southeast New Mexico. My job was incredibly enjoyable, and I had made some of the closest friends out there, including my fiance. The landscape was absolutely gorgeous. The ranch occupied almost 2,000 acres of rolling prairie and scrubland, with the back half being thickets of cactus and mesquite. The edge of the property was part of the Tonkawa River, and with a huge field leading down the hill to the bank. I'm creating a map of the property, because locations will become important to the story. The first time I saw anything that gave me pause was one of my first nights at the ranch. We were due for some rain that night, and in the morning I had to demonstrate how to start a fire to a group I was taking out on trail. Not wanting to embarrass myself with wet wood, I had the bright idea to go gather some before it started raining. Unfortunately for me, this was around 10 p.m. and was the only bright thing that night. We were about 40 minutes outside the nearest town, and with the sky being overcast, my weak little flashlight barely illuminated the path ahead of me. We had this huge old oak tree just right in front of the tree line, and that was my destination. After a bit of a walk, you got to the tree and started piling wood into a bucket I brought. I've never had much of a problem with being out in the woods at night, but that night was so dark. It was difficult to keep my thoughts from straying into eerie places. After a couple minutes, I felt like I was being watched. I started to glance around, but the hair-raising sensation of no longer being alone became a bit overwhelming, and I was less and less confident being out there. As I turned around towards the trail, I froze. Staring out of the darkness were two glowing green eyes. They didn't blink or move, just stared at me. They were roughly 40 feet away on the other side of the path I had to reach. My gut wrenched. It was just so unnerving. I slowly walked forward till I got to the path and then started to back away, never turning my back from them. My flashlight was too dim to ever see what the eyes belonged to, but just the fact I had to look slightly up at them made my skin crawl. Finally, when I judged I was far enough away, I turned and ran down the path back down to the road, to our guest area, and to my house. The morning after, I had to run a camera to a group that was gathering at the oak tree. As I was leaving, I realized that place where the eyes had been was a clearing. The eyes were roughly in the middle of the clearing, and it was large enough in diameter that there was no way they could have belonged to something in a tree. I'm well over 6 feet tall. Based off of how far back I had to tilt my head to meet its gaze, it was easily over 7 feet tall. The realization made my blood run cold. Now, of course, nobody believed me. At first. But this was only the first encounter with whatever prowled those woods, and the only one where I was ever alone. My second run-in with this thing was about 4 months later in June. New summer staff arrived, and I was the only carryover into a new season. In our staff lounge one evening, I joined a group of about 9 other staff sharing creepy stories. My friend Elijah was in the middle of a doozy. When he was finished, he begged me to tell mine again. He'd heard it before, but he was the only one. I told everybody I could tell them, or I could show them where it happened. Of course, everybody elected to go out to the oak with me. Once we were there, I told my tale and left everyone sufficiently on edge. The mood was still light, and since we were out there anyway, Elijah suggested we head out to a large boulder deeper in the trees. The group was even between guys and girls, and there was a definite flirtatious vibe between most, so we agreed. Now, to get to this boulder, we would cross through the pasture that led down to the river, and afterwards down this very narrow path where the brush was so thick and the trail was so windy, you couldn't get more than around 10 feet of visibility in front and behind you, with nothing on either side. We made it through the pasture with no difficulty besides Elijah scaring one of the girls by jumping out from behind a tree. Once on the narrow path, we had to walk 2 abreast, and my other buddy Alexander and I took up the rear. He and I were the only 2 who heard the voice. Calling out from the pasture we were just at, it almost seemed female, but was completely devoid of emotion or pain, calling out softly, "Ow, help me." Alexa and I looked at each other, our eyes huge. I'm sure I was also as pale as he looked. There should have been nobody else out there with us. Our group was the only ones with the night off, and it wasn't very plausible that a group of guests would be out there, and we didn't encounter them. Besides, anyone trying to mess with us surely would have just screamed or just even said more. I cannot begin to describe how wrong the voice was. The tone and inflection were almost robotic, and "ow, help me" was all it said. We started to hurry everyone else up without freaking them out, and we came out of that section of trail with the 2 of us looking behind us constantly. When we got to the boulder, we tried to convince everyone to head back, but to no avail. Finally, Alex and I said we were going to leave, but as we turned around, we all saw the deer. It was on the trail we just exited, just standing there, watching us. But so much of it was wrong. It was much taller than any other deer we'd seen out there, and there were plenty. It was also somehow longer and crooked. Its head almost looked like it was put on sideways, so its neck. It just stood there looking at us. Its appearance generally unnerving, but what it did next was what frightened me the most. It backed up into the trees until we could no longer see it. That's what freaked me out the most. Every deer I've ever seen either turns outright and runs away, or just freezes till you get too close. This one just backed up out of sight. It was such a simple movement, but it was so unnatural. Exactly like the call for help. We all looked around at each other nervously for a few minutes, then scrambled off the rock. When we were all huddled in a group, we ran, together past where we'd seen it last, tore across the pasture, and past the oak tree, till we stood panting on the porch of the lounge. We never really spoke of that night together again, but I always include it in any reading of this story. I have one more large encounter, the one that made me refuse to go back in the woods after dark. One thing you must understand is that there were several months between these 3 accounts. Enough time for me to think, surely whatever this was isn't still here, right? The final time I went into those woods was with my now fiancé. She and I had just started officially dating about a week before this terrible camping trip. I'd grown up camping as a kid, but she'd never been, wanting to share with her something I found incredibly meaningful in my early life. I convinced her to join me for one night trip out into the woods. My plan was to go out there Friday evening through Sunday morning, and since she had to work Saturday, she joined me for my final night out there. Friday night was completely uneventful. I pitched my tent out of one of the dirt access roads in one of the spots used for overnight groups. It was a very average solo camping trip. I enjoyed myself completely. The next Saturday, my fiancée Haley drove up the dirt road to join me. It was once again a very nice evening, making hot dogs and s'mores, and after a couple beers, we retired to the tent. As we settled down for the night, we both heard something out in the woods. Haley turned to ask me if I had also heard something, but I regretfully snapped at her to be quiet. There was no anger, but at that sound, the other 2 frightening stories I had were the forefront of my mind. The sound we heard was very faint. If it hadn't lasted more than a few seconds, it could have been dismissed as wind. But it lasted much longer. It was singing, but completely toneless, devoid of any kind of humanity. It grew steadily louder, making wide half circles towards our campsite. Our site was in a clearing off an access road. We were way out past the boulder from a few months previous. The clearing was surrounded by prickly pear and mesquite, basically creating a massive barbed wire fence around us. The only clear spot was the path that led to the road. But the singing was coming from the opposite end of the clearing. Something was out in the woods, making its way through thorns and scrub, singing in a language we'd never heard before. Haley looked as terrified as I felt. I unzipped the tent and peered out with my light into the tree line. I couldn't see anything, but I could tell from the singing that whatever it was just out of my view, less than 100 feet from the tent. It knew where we were, and didn't care if we knew where it was. I told Haley to run to the car. She scrambled out of the tent and ran through the dark towards her car. I followed, barefoot, only in shorts, with my knife and phone clutched in my hand. We made to the car as the singing became deafeningly loud. We sped back to our lodging and spent the night wide awake in her room, her lying on the bed, and I propped against the door, occasionally checking the windows. Well into morning, we drove back up to pick up our stuff. The tent had been torn apart. Everything else was ransacked. A horrible odor pervaded the clearing. What sent shivers down my spine, however, were the massive scratches and gouges in the tree nearest where the tent lay scattered. We finished up our contract and quickly moved to Colorado together. We also work at a ranch up here, and I am glad to say nothing about the woods up here feels malevolent. I've never heard any singing or seen any wrong deer or been asked for help from any weird voices. I'm completely content to stay far away from the mesquite thickets of New Mexico for the rest of my life.